NASA and SpaceX realign Crew Dragon's upcoming manifest, Blue lays off 10% of its workforce, Stoke announces a redesign of its reusable upper stage engine, and Rocket Lab releases more information about its Neutron rocket. As always, we'll have all that and a whole lot more coming up this week in Spaceflight. If I told you that we had news this week about a fully reusable rocket made of stainless steel that uses full-flow staged combustion Methalox engines and that it hot stages for stage separation, you might think I'm talking about SpaceX's Starship rocket. But the first story of this week's show is actually about Stoke's Nova rocket. This week, the company revealed a number of updates about Nova, mainly centered around the second stage engine. Right from the start, one of the things that we learned was that the engine's name is Andromeda, which is a name that actually fits well with the theme of the rocket, given that the first stage engine is called Zenith and the rocket itself is called Nova. But the most exciting part of the update was the news about all of the design upgrades for the engine. Now, in case you don't remember, this is a unique engine that runs on hydrogen fuel and contains multiple thrusters around a central, cryogenically cooled heat shield. This heat shield protects the second stage of Nova during its re-entry, and the multiple thrusters can be used for ascent as well as for landing. The company performed a hop test in 2023, demonstrating that the engine could be operated for both launch and landing operations. According to Stoke, the new design changes are aimed at improving performance, increasing downmass capacity, and reducing parts. One of the changes that's most visually significant is the change in the shape of the engine and heat shield assembly. While the earlier version had asymmetry built into the shape of the heat shield, this one is now a smooth dome across the entirety of the structure's base. Also, in the earlier design, the engine's thrusters were separate from the base heat shield, whereas in this new design, they're embedded with the heat shield on its perimeter. The number of thrusters has also changed, going from 30 down to 24 thrusters, but each one being slightly bigger. Stoke also says that these thruster nozzles can operate in two different modes, with one mode optimized for the vacuum of space and the other dedicated to sea-level operations. Another new change for Nova now comes in the form of hot staging to separate the first and second stages. This is thanks to the engine upgrades on Andromeda, which puts the engine's thrusters outside of the perimeter of the first stage, allowing them to fire freely, while the first stage is still attached. Stoke also claims that their firing isn't expected to cause damage to the first stage by saying, quote, "without the need for a heavy one-time use interstage shield to protect stage 1. I wonder what they could be referring to. What remains to be seen is how exactly those two stages will be mated together for flight, but I guess we'll see that once we get closer to Nova's first launch. That launch is now more of a reality because, as you may have seen during this story, the Andromeda engine is not a CGI render or a PowerPoint slide. It's real, and its new design is now on the test stand at Stoke's Moses Lake test site. The last thing that we now know is that the company was aiming to launch twice in 2025, but as usual with first-time launches, this could still delay a bit into 2026. What's for sure though is that with this hardware already on the test stand, it's much closer than ever before. And now let's check in with the missions currently on their way to the moon and a few others that are planned for the future. Firefly's Blue Ghost lander is now officially on its way to the moon. The lander had been hanging out in Earth orbit since its launch about a month ago on January 15th, and in this time, Firefly has performed loads of tests to make sure that the lander and its payloads were ready for their missions. During this process, Blue Ghost sent back 15 gigabytes of data, including science data from NASA's payloads. NASA confirmed that all of its payloads are healthy and ready for operations on the lunar surface. Well, this week, Blue Ghost finally left Earth orbit as it fired up its thrusters for the translunar injection burn, sending the lander on a 4-day trip toward the moon. The next day, Blue Ghost performed a planned correction maneuver to fine-tune its trajectory, which proved so successful that Firefly canceled a second planned trajectory correction maneuver. Now on its way to the moon, Blue Ghost took this image of our home planet, and you see that small speck below it? That's the moon. While it might look pretty far away in this picture, Blue Ghost's lunar transit lasted only 4 days. In fact, it arrived in lunar orbit just as we were wrapping up the script of this video, and Firefly reported that the lander nailed its challenging lunar orbit insertion burn. Blue Ghost will now spend 16 days orbiting our celestial companion before attempting its landing at dawn of the lunar day on March 2nd. And now on to Blue Ghost's launch companion, iSpace's Hakuto-R lander named Resilience. The two landers might have taken the same ride into space, but they're each taking very different routes to their destination. But it just so happens that both reached a very similar point in their journeys around the same time. Like Blue Ghost, Resilience has been orbiting Earth since its launch, albeit at a higher orbit. This week, the lander reached the apogee of its final Earth orbit, or the point at which the lander is furthest from Earth at 460,000 kilometers, but because of orbital mechanics, its velocity is also at its minimum of 760 kilometers per hour. Now that still might seem pretty fast, but when Resilience was at the nearest point of its orbit, its velocity was 29,000 kilometers per hour. As Resilience continues its orbital trajectory back towards the Earth, it'll encounter the Moon, but it won't be able to land there just yet. Instead, the lander will use the Moon's gravity to change its trajectory in a so-called gravity assist. This flyby swings Resilience onto a path that goes far past the Moon's orbit, but will ultimately let the lander intercept the Moon using way less propellant. The cost of this low energy transfer is that it does take much longer, so Resilience is expected to land on the Moon no sooner than 3.5 months from now. The next mission to leave our planet on a moon-bound trajectory is IM-2 from Intuitive Machines. It's set to lift off in a few short weeks, but while SpaceX and Intuitive Machines are preparing for this mission, NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory is getting ready for the next mission after that, IM-3. For this mission, NASA will provide a trio of small rovers for the Cooperative Autonomous Distributed Robotic Exploration Demonstration, or CADRA for short. Once on the surface of the Moon, these 3 rovers will collaborate autonomously without input from Earth. Well, some input from Earth will be necessary. For example, controllers might instruct the rovers to explore a certain area, but from that point, they're on their own. The rovers will choose their own path, they'll avoid hazards, and they'll decide what to study all by themselves. They'll even appoint one of the 3 as a leader for their expedition, which will distribute the work to make sure that the mission goals are met. This week, JPL packed up and shipped the rovers to Intuitive Machines' facility in Houston, where they'll be integrated on the lander. The IM-3 mission is currently expected to land on the Moon early next year. Now, NASA may have designed the CADRA to operate with minimal human intervention, but they are also still preparing to send humans to the Moon with the Artemis program. In April of 2026, the Artemis 2 mission will send astronauts around the Moon for the first time since Apollo 17 in 1972. This week, the Artemis 2 crew suited up for a training session in the simulator at NASA's Johnson Space Center, where the crew of 4 practiced reconfiguring their capsule. This is needed to change the capsule from its launch configuration into a habitable space where the astronauts can comfortably spend the journey around the Moon and back. After that, the crew practiced suiting up ahead of re-entry on their way back home. The pressure suits protect the astronauts during dynamic phases of the mission, and re-entry at lunar velocity is no joke. So it's an important training step to make sure that the astronauts are ready for their mission. Meanwhile, China is also getting ready to land humans on the Moon. This week, we learned the names of the spacesuit and the rover that will support these missions, both of which have now entered their initial stage of development. The lunar EVA suit that astronauts will wear on their moonwalks is called Wang Yu, which roughly translates to looking into the universe. To explore a larger area during these moonwalks, China is also developing a rover called Tan Suo, which means exploration, and it has a similar function to the Lunar Roving Vehicle or moon buggy from the Apollo program. Tan Suo can travel up to 10 kilometers from the landing site. NASA astronauts Sunita Williams and Butch Wilmore are now scheduled to return home slightly earlier than previously planned. For those who may not remember, Sunny and Butch went to the space station back in June of last year as test pilots for Boeing's Starliner crew flight test. However, that Starliner spacecraft suffered thruster issues on its way to the station, and after much careful review, NASA decided to not return the 2 astronauts back home on that same Starliner. Instead, the plan changed and they would be incorporated into the next crew rotation mission of the ISS at the time, which was Crew 9. Now that mission would take place using a SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft, and it would go up with 2 crew members, Nick Hague and Alexander Gorbunov. Then, at the end of the mission, both would return home alongside Butch and Sunny. At the time, that was planned to happen in February of this year. Crew rotation missions on the ISS last on an average about 6 months, with the exact length often being as short as 5 months or as long as 7 months, hence why we say 6 months on average. The rotation of crews is also done directly, that is, the next set of crew members always launches and arrives at the station before the previous one departs. This is called a direct handover, and it's always preferred to an indirect handover, which is when the next crew arrives after the previous one has departed. Now, the reason why this is preferred is at its core due to safety. It's better to have more people on the ISS during a handover than too little, which is what happens during an indirect handover. The old crew can also properly explain to the new one all of the ongoing tasks and experiments and get them trained on emergency procedures before they go home. Also, with the overlap, the incoming crew doesn't have to jump in and get to work right away. It gives them a few days to get used to the weirdness of space and just familiarize themselves with their new home for the next 6 months. So when Sunny and Butch were supposed to return in February of 2025, it was because that's when SpaceX's Crew 10 mission was supposed to launch, which would lead to a short overlap of crews and then Crew 9's return home. Crew 10 was also going to be the first flight of the new Crew Dragon capsule with serial number C213, which is also the 5th and last new Dragon capsule to be built. However, SpaceX has had issues manufacturing this capsule and getting it ready for flight. So in December, it was decided that the Crew 10 launch would be delayed by about a month to March 25th so that extra work could take place. That in turn meant that Sunny and Butch's return would be moved to a late March, early April timeframe. But this week, NASA and SpaceX announced a change in these plans once again. According to the news, the capsule has been taking even longer than expected to prepare for flight, resulting in a further delay of the Crew 10 mission to get up to the ISS, and also for Sunny and Butch to return on Crew 9. See, it's not just that they need to come back home, it's also the fact that the new crew has to go up at some point, and they can't just be sitting around on Earth indefinitely. So in order to carry this out, the decision was made to swap capsules. Crew 10 will fly on Crew Dragon Endurance instead of flying with still unnamed capsule C213. Endurance can be ready for launch earlier, so the launch of Crew 10 is now planned for March 12th instead of the 25th. Endurance has had a number of mission assignment swaps, so it's not its first rodeo. In fact, since its last mission, it's now had 3 change of assignments. After supporting Crew 7 between fall of 2023 and winter of 2024, Endurance was supposed to fly on Crew 9, but it was later assigned to fly on the From 2 mission, which at the time was planned for launch in December of 2024. Then the capsule changed missions again and was assigned to the Axiom 4 mission, scheduled at the time for the March-April timeframe of this year. With this new plan, Axiom 4 has moved to later in the spring, and it is now expected to use the newly built Dragon capsule while Endurance flies on Crew 10. Now, if you're lost with all of this, here's an easier summary of the missions being supported by SpaceX's Crew Dragon. Endeavour returned from orbit last fall, and it'll likely launch this summer on the Crew 11 mission. Resilience was used during the Polaris Dawn mission and will next support the From 2 mission. Endurance is assigned for Crew 10. Freedom is currently in orbit as part of the Crew 9 mission, and C213 will be flying on Axiom 4. It's definitely not easy having to manage a fleet of 5 reusable spacecraft when all carry crew on board on each launch and need to launch regularly. Once the Crew 10 mission arrives at the ISS and the crews spend a few days with each other, Nick, Alexander, Sunny, and Butch will be able to return home, hopefully before the end of the month of March. For some of you watching, part of this backstory may have already been familiar since we have been talking about this and covering it all along. If you don't want to miss more coverage like that, be sure to subscribe to our channel, like our videos, and follow us on social media. It's all free and it supports us as well. Now we'll take a glimpse at some other stories across space, starting with Earth, which got a swanky new belt. 2 belts actually, and not of the fashion variety. Last year, our planet was hit by the largest solar storm in 2 decades. That stream of charged particles caused beautiful auroras around the world, but these particles also got trapped in Earth's magnetic field. Now, this isn't a particularly unusual thing. You may have heard of the Van Allen radiation belts, which is a set of 2 belts of charged particles trapped in the magnetic field around the planet. But a study published last week found that last year's solar storm created 2 additional belts between them, which also lasted much longer than scientists expected. Usually, temporary belts last for about 4 weeks, but this time they lasted well over 3 months. Now, these radiation belts can cause problems for satellites, but coincidentally, they were actually discovered by a malfunctioning satellite. NASA's Colorado Inner Radiation Belt Experiment, or CIRBE CubeSat, suddenly stopped working in April of last year before the solar storm. But on June 15th, it suddenly came back to life just in time to study what was left by the storm. The Indian Space Research Organization and the European Space Agency have successfully tested radio communications for India's Gaganyaan human spaceflight program. ISRO wants to use the European Space Tracking Network to communicate with the Gaganyaan capsule when it's out of sight of the country's own tracking and communication assets. This allows ISRO to stay in contact with the spacecraft and its astronauts for a longer period during each orbit. Now, it's not uncommon for space agencies to collaborate on satellite communications, and this isn't the first time for ISRO and ESA either. ESA provided deep space communications for India's Chandrayaan-3 lunar mission in 2023, and also for the country's Aditya L1 solar observatory that launched that same year. The two agencies signed an agreement for the collaboration in December and have now successfully verified that their communication systems can, well, communicate. This week, Rocket Lab published the Payload User's Guide for its upcoming rocket called Neutron. The Payload User's Guide is a document for potential customers who want to buy a launch and fly their satellite on Neutron. The document contains loads of graphs and tables detailing all sorts of things like the temperature and acoustic levels during launch, as well as the rocket's payload capacity, which includes the previously unreleased numbers for geostationary transfer orbits. An interesting thing that we caught in this document is how the payload is mated to the rocket ahead of launch. If you remember, Neutron's first stage also includes the fairing that encapsulates the upper stage and the payload, which is supposed to make reuse easier. Rocket Lab's website previously showed that the payload and upper stage would be lowered into the rocket vertically, but a new diagram in this Payload User's Guide shows that that's not the case. Instead, the first stage is made up of two segments, a core module with the tanks and engines, and an upper module with the fairing and interstage. It seems that the payload and second stage will be integrated into the upper module, which will then be stacked on the core module out at the launch site. NASA has reached an important milestone for the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope, which is designed to help astronomers answer questions about dark energy, exoplanets, and infrared astrophysics. This week, the agency installed a sunshade. This sunshade, or deployable aperture cover, isn't like your everyday sunglasses, but rather more like a two-layered curtain that blocks light coming in from the side. Blocking this stray light vastly improves the telescope's sensitivity to faint light, and it helps to keep the telescope's instruments at a stable temperature. Recently, NASA integrated the telescope and its main instruments onto the spacecraft's satellite bus. The sunshield was installed on a separate part, however, the so-called outer barrel assembly. This structure will slide over the instruments and protect them from the harsh environment of space. This final integration is expected by the end of the year. NASA has now passed the key milestone of completing the project's fabrication stage, and the project is still on schedule for launch no later than May of 2027. Blue Origin is downsizing. This week, the company's leadership called in all employees for a meeting and announced that it would let go of 10% of them, which equates to more than 1,000 people. During the meeting, CEO Dave Limp cited that the company had been hiring too many people in positions where they're no longer needed. Apparently, this hiring spree led to too much bureaucracy, and now the company wants to prune the organization's structure, cutting management as well as engineering roles. The layoffs come at an interesting time for the company, as Blue recently debuted its New Glenn rocket on a fairly successful first mission. Now, the first stage didn't land as planned, but the flight couldn't have gone better otherwise. Unfortunately, as a reward, some of those people who worked on the success are now being handed layoffs. It's more like lay-oofs. We feel for you. By refocusing the organization, Blue's management wants to position the company for future success. They hope to get New Glenn up to speed and are working on big projects like a lunar lander and the Orbital Reef space station. We'd love to see these plans come to fruition, but we wish that they didn't involve 1,000 people losing their jobs. Now let's take a look at the space traffic of the week and see what's coming up next week in spaceflight. We started off the week with a Falcon 9 lifting off from Florida on February 8th at 1918 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40. On board were 21 Starlink satellites headed to low Earth orbit. 8 of them were regular Starlink V2 mini satellites, while the other 13 were direct-to-cell satellites. The first stage for this mission, B-1078, was flying for a 17th time, and it successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship, a Shortfall of Gravitas. Later that day, we had Rocket Lab's first launch of 2025 with its Electron rocket taking flight on February 8th at 2043 UTC from the company's launch site in New Zealand. Electron was carrying a batch of 5 Kinéis satellites into low Earth orbit for this mission. These Kinéis satellites are part of a constellation of 25 small satellites dedicated to Internet of Things applications, which is why Rocket Lab named this mission IoT for You and Me. Rocket Lab is still under contract to launch another batch of Kinéis satellites on Electron, which should take place later this year. And speaking of batches of satellites and supporting constellations in low Earth orbit, this week we also had 3 launches on the same day, all delivering batches of satellites in support of constellations in low Earth orbit. The first of these 3 took place from California, with the Falcon 9 lifting off on February 11th at 2:09 UTC from Space Launch Complex 4 East. The rocket was carrying 23 Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. As usual, the first stage for this mission, B-1071, was flight proven and was flying for a 23rd time, making it the 5th booster to fly that many times. As a veteran flyer, the booster successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship, Of Course I Still Love You. Later that day, we had a new rocket debut from China. The first flight of the Changzheng 8A took place on February 11th at 9:30 UTC from Launch Complex 2 at the Wenchang Satellite Launch Center. The rocket was carrying a batch of Guowang satellites into low Earth orbit. The Changzheng 8A rocket is an improved version of the standard Changzheng 8 rocket. The rocket shares the same first stage and booster configuration, but the second stage has been widened to match the diameter of the core stage. The second stage has also been redesigned to include a common bulkhead tank design instead of using separate tanks, which gives the rocket's second stage a larger propellant capacity and performance. To compensate for the increased propellant capacity, the second stage is also fitted with upgraded engines with more thrust. All in all, these upgrades increase the rocket's payload capacity by about 40% compared to the standard Changzheng 8. Despite the experimental purpose of the flight, the rocket was carrying the second batch of operational Guowang Space Internet satellites. Little is known about the size and mass of these satellites, and it's unclear how many of them were carried on board, but early tracking data from the US Space Force indicates that up to 8 satellites may have been on board the Changzheng 8A during this mission. Also on February 11th, we had another Starlink launch, this time from Florida. The mission started at 1853 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40 and was carrying another mix of 13 direct-to-cell and 8 Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. The first stage for this mission, B-1077, was flying for an 18th time, and it successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship, Just Read the Instructions. With the Starlink launches performed this week, SpaceX has now launched a total of 7,929 satellites into orbit, of which 899 have re-entered and 6,264 have moved into their operational orbit. Going into next week, we'll have many more Starlink launches, with the first one coming up on February 15th from Florida. The 4-hour launch window for that mission is set to open at 5 o'clock UTC. A few days later, we'll have another Falcon 9 from Vandenberg carrying a batch of Starshield satellites for the National Reconnaissance Office as part of the agency's proliferated space architecture. The roughly 2.5-hour window for this mission is set to open on February 17th at 13:18 UTC. Later in the week, we'll have another Starlink launch, but this one will be special. The mission, Starlink Group 1012, will be the first to try out the new drone ship landing zone in the middle of the Bahamas. Those in the area will be able to see the re-entering first stage and will likely hear a sonic boom as a result. The roughly 4-hour launch window for this mission is set to open on February 18th at 2300 UTC. If schedules hold, shortly after that, an Electron will be launching from New Zealand again with the first satellite of Black Sky's third generation of satellites. The mission, called Fasten Your Space Belts, is currently set to take place within a launch window that opens on February 18th at 2315 UTC. And towards the end of the week, we'll have another Starlink launch from Vandenberg, and this one's somewhat special too, as it's the first launch of a new group of Starlink missions, Group 15. The roughly 4-hour launch window is set to open on February 20th at midnight UTC. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Alicia Siegel for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.